Welcome to Science for Hire with your host, Dr. Charles Handler. Science for Hire provides 30 minutes of enlightenment on best practices and news from the front lines of the employment testing universe.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Science for Hire. I am your host, Dr. Charles Handler, and today I have a guest with a different background, and I always love it when guests with different backgrounds dive into the kind of stuff that I do and we do, because it's important stuff. Hiring is just super important, and if you just look at the EU AI Act, I mean, it is listed as a high risk area, which is really cool. So my guest today, different background, journalist and aficionado of the rights of humans in hiring. And it is Hilke Schellman. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for having me. Such
Cool.
a joy to be on the podcast that I've been listening to for years. So I consider myself lucky to be.
Well, thank you so much. I consider myself lucky too. And just tell our audience, I always say I like my guests to introduce themselves because who knows them better than them. So tell us a little bit about your background. You got some interesting.
That's what you say, but maybe a personality assessment knows me better than
Oh,
I do
no,
myself.
Don't start with that nonsense. Don't start with that. No, it's true. But I have, that would be interesting if I made all my guests take a personality assessment before the
totally.
show. And then I say, well, you're not very extroverted. What's with that? Maybe you can work on that. Because there's always that.
The show.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that kind of discussion of, can you change personality or are you stuck with it? I believe you can at least maybe not change it, but you can do interventions on yourself. Like I have a lot of personality traits that I'm, feel pretty hardwired on, but I work on them and I don't let them show up in, when the triggers are there. It's a lot of work.
Totally. I had to work on I'm actually a very shy person, which is wild, but I had to work on myself and just be I'm going to go to every reception. I'm going to shake people's hand. I'm going to introduce myself to strangers.
Yeah.
And, I have a much easier time as a journalist doing that than, as a human being. As a journalist is my job. So it's perfect. Oh, my job. I call up people. No problem. But weirdly, in social functions, I'm so I had to work on that. But, we can evolve and have strategies to overcome these things, and we work it out as humans. Maybe that is the beauty of humanity. But sorry,
Exactly.
We're getting sidetracked.
That's okay. That's fun.
So my name is Hilke Schellman. I'm a reporter, and I'm also a journalism professor at New York University. And what I do is I just, I'm a curious person. So I let my curiosity drive myself to find new reporting things. And I sort of take very deep dives. So I usually do, I did a film for Frontline. I do long form investigative pieces. I looked at facial recognition. I went to Pakistan. I did all kinds of things, just trying to find what are sort of systemic problems that we need to shine a light on.
No shortage of those.
Yes.
In our crazy world.
Journalists are very busy, it turns out.
Yeah.
And I found this topic actually 6 years ago in November 2017. I was taking a Lyft ride in Washington, D.C. from a convention center to a train station. I talked to the driver and I asked him, how are you doing? How are you? And the driver was he's like, I'm having a really weird day, and I'm a journalist. I'm oh yeah, tell me more. Why is it weird? And he was like, oh, I had a job interview by a robot. And I was job interview by a robot? Tell me more. So he had applied to a baggage handler position. This was in the very early days. So I don't actually think it was a robot. It's probably a pre-recorded phone call, right? With pre-recorded messages. But I had never heard of that. And I was oh, that's so fascinating. And then, I started looking into it. I went to an AI and fairness conference, and somebody who had just left the EEOC was there talking about small scale algorithm, looking at people's calendars, emails, and finding out how long you work, and very basic algorithmic applications. And she was worried that folks, mothers, people with disabilities might get penalized because they have higher rates of absences. And she felt oh, this could be discrimination, and we're not looking at this. And there's hardly people in the room. And I started talking to people and I was like, oh, there's a lot going on in this field. Into PsyOp, I was blown away by what I saw. Into HR Tech. I mean, then
Yep, I
my
saw
head
you
was
there.
hurting after
Remember
HR
that?
Tech.
Yeah. Oh, it's difficult. Yeah.
And I saw all this tech moving into the space. And, I have an affinity for math and statistic. I know it's wild. I was missing it. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting. Let's talk about how we quantify humans. And maybe we found, the magic way to do it. Turns out it's all a lot more complicated than that.
Well, people are complicated. That's the thing, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
So,
totally. So that was sort of the beginning into this. So I don't know, for the book, maybe I talked to probably 200, 300 people. And with some, I talked to them many times and talked to job applicant vendors. I talked to people who are HR managers, experts, IOs, like
yeah.
anyone under the sun who wanted to talk to me.
Yeah, so you got a lot of practice talking to strangers. I am a shy extrovert, so I'll perform, I'll get in front of people and go bananas. Put me in a room with people I don't know and have no reason to really talk to, and I'm pretty shy about it, but I'm working on it. I introduced myself to somebody at my kid's baseball game the other night, and came home and told my wife how proud I was of myself. I walked up to him because his kid's on the team. Hey, how you doing? All right. I don't do that very often, but it was rewarding. It felt good. It felt really good.
Yeah, and it turns out most people who stand around, they're actually kind of grateful if somebody approaches them, right? Like
Yeah.
other parents, like I have a 3-year-old toddler too. Like there's a lot of parents who stand on the playground. It's actually nice to like chat and have a
Oh,
moment.
yeah.
But everyone is kind of like, and I have that feeling too that I'm like, I don't know. But it turns out most people are super nice, and if they're not nice, well, you just move
Yeah.
on.
Well, I know exactly. Well, and having only one kid, what you're talking about, what a great way to benchmark if you're crazy or not, or if your kid's like way doing something strange or not, and then once they get to be like 10, like mine, it's the conversation of, oh, how do you handle video games at your house? Is it a pestilence on your house like it is on mine? So
Wait, well, we're already talking about like YouTube Kids and something like that. 3-year-olds, they're like, I have a 3-year-old going on 15. She's like ready to move out, wants to do everything by herself.
Yeah,
She's
yeah.
like, why do I have parents? They're like in the way.
I know. Well, she needs you very badly. Well, cool. So you wrapped all this stuff up, and like I said, we've known each other for a while. I've been lucky enough to
Yes.
participate in a few interviews with you, but you have a view that into. I mean, all the people you talk to, I dabble in talking to those people, and kind of build my own worldview as a composite, which is the best way to do it. And you have a book. You turn that into a book, and we're here to talk about that book, but before you get started, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but if you had to encapsulate everything you talked about and everything in your book into one or maybe two sentences, what's the biggest takeaway from it?
We wish AI tools in hiring and in the world of work are magic, but we have an awful lot more to do, and we have to be an awful lot more skeptical.
Yeah. Good. I agree. And I will just say, as I said before, people are complicated. And, in my world, even your traditional tools, and I would challenge an AI tool really to do better than this or incrementally better.
Yeah, I agree.
If you're explaining like 20% of the variance in job performance through your predictive measures, you're a hero. I mean, and at scale, that saves a lot of money, but it is a very imprecise thing. I feel like the day that it's perfect is a scary day, because then somebody can really understand a person at a level that's so personal. And there's contextual things that people have. I mean, you may even look great and you are great, but you have a life event happen, or your spouse moves, or whatever it is, man.
Oh, totally, right? Like, how can we predict, like, and I feel in general for hiring, it feels a little unfair. Like, we test and prod the individual, but they're going into teams, so I can hire the best individuals. They go into a toxic team with a toxic manager, they're probably not going to perform well, right? Like, that's a consideration. Then also, like, obviously life events, something no one is in control, right? Like, we can predict, but life around us happens. So like there's so many factors that go into hiring. And I think one question is like, how much can we really predict here? And the question is also like, how much is AI helping us with that?
Or hurting us with that?
That's good. That's true too. Like, I started looking into it. I remember like going to like the first PSYOP and going to one of the, this is like early days, 2018. So 5 years ago, in the early days of AI and hiring. And we were all so excited. And, it felt like magic. We're doing like pattern, motion recognition on faces and like intonation of our voices, the words that we say. And I was like, wow, there might be a tool that has done something that humans could never do, is like precise hiring. It seems, wonderful. But then when you start digging deeper, you all know this. It's like, wait, what do facial expression and job interviews have to do with like the actual job and doing the job? And, what are some of the problems that come up when we like use people who are currently in the job and we use their facial expressions, and in job interviews, does it even have anything to do with the job? So, this is like, and I think this correlation soup, maybe we should call it, or so, like that has come up again and again and again. Like we find these correlations, these statistical patterns, but are they actually meaningful is sort of a question that I've encountered again and again and again, looking at all these different tools, right? Like looking at resume screeners, and I had a couple of people who have come forward who do, who are lawyers, so sort of lawyer adjacent, who look under the hood when big companies try to use the tool. And, one of them found out when he looked at the technical reports and, talked to folks and dug deep into the tool, that one of the tools was predicting that somebody who put hobbies like basketball and football predicted success in a job, which had nothing to do with sports. The job is just a like middle of the road job. So that's kind of a problem, right? And then the other one was actually pushing right into potential gender discrimination, because it had it upweighed people who put the word baseball on their resume, and it downgraded folks who had put the word softball on their resume.
Oh,
And, softball is
female
often
sport.
associated with women.
Or people who drink a lot of beer. Yeah.
So, there is, there's all these kinds of problems that when I talk to folks came up again and again. And I was like, whoa, like these tools are out in the wild. We use them and we have so little knowledge about these. And that is just the surface. And there's a lot more there. Other online screeners did like Syria and Canada. The name Thomas apparently was a predictor for success, probably because, statistical correlations, statistical patterns. There were enough people named Thomas in the pile, right? And a computer doesn't understand that we shouldn't be looking at this. Like this has actually nothing to do with a job.
Right.
It's just a random.
Right.
It's just a correlation. It doesn't cause anything. It doesn't make you good at your job. But a computer doesn't know that. So if we don't look over these kinds of tools and continually monitoring them, these kinds of problems can seep in all the time. And we see that again and again, and same with like, I played an awful lot of AI games for job performance. I kind of enjoyed it. Like, at the beginning, actually, I also did like online screens of my Twitter and LinkedIn to find my personality. And, at the beginning, I was like really, I was kind of like anxious a little bit and worried. I was like, what are they going to find out about myself that I don't know? And over time, I was like, I'm not sure if this is actually right. And sometimes, I had like an AI tool looking over my Twitter and over my LinkedIn, and I had like the opposite personalities in both of them. So it was like either I have multiple personalities, or this tool just doesn't work because we don't express ourselves the same on social media, or maybe it doesn't even work at all, right? So like, the anxiety lessened and lessened as I was playing these games. But the same, some of the problems happen again in AI games, right? Like why do I have to hit the space bar as fast as I can? Like, what does it have to do with any job you've ever done? That's sort of a question. But then also when you think about it, like, these are often calibrated on people who are successful in the job. It means often they're basically working in the job, right? So like if they play the game, maybe they all are risk takers. But then the question is like, does risk taking actually have anything to do with the job, right? It might just be that all your 50 call center employees are risk takers.
Right.
Good for you.
Well, if they were in call center job, they may not be too big of a risk taker, because that's a tough job.
Who knows? Yeah.
Well,
who knows? But there's all kinds of questions that come with like almost every tool I've looked at. So I think we have like way more work to do. And I sort of feel like, now that I'm talking to like probably an audience that has done, I've seen a lot of these tools, has looked into them. And I feel like, what I've done is like, I've tested them all in a different way if I could, when I was able to. And I sort of want people like to steal my methods. Like I'm actually not a data scientist. I really can't code for my life. I mean, I can sort of check code that like I see you coded something and you're not like fooling me, but that's the extent I can do. But, if I can talk to a tool that's supposed to, an AI tool is supposed to figure out how good my English competency is. So I spoke to it in English first. I got an 8.5 out of 9. I was very proud because English is my second language. So I was like, oh, yeah, this tool is great. And then I was like, oh, let's test it a little bit, right? Like I ran silence through it. There's like no, you don't get a result at all, which, is totally expected. And when I had talked to vendors before, they told me like, oh, you have to, we're always concerned about people with accents, people with speech impairments, what happens, if the tool doesn't fully sort of quote unquote understand what they're saying, or, the transcription isn't accurate. And vendors always say, oh, the tool would totally get that. And, you have to rise to a certain level. So I was like, okay, let's just try and speak to the tool in German. So I read the psychometrics article in Wikipedia in German, die Psychometrie, blah, 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 blah. I didn't speak a word of English. So I sent it out, send it out. And I thought for sure I would get like an error message or something because not a language that it can predict upon. But it turns out I got a 6 out of 9 competency level. I was competent in speaking English. And I was like, wait, what? I didn't speak a word of English. Like I just spoke in German. And, and then I got, we did this like 50 more times and I talked to the developers. So like, I'm a journalist. I believe in like balance and like reaching out to folks and just be like, hey, I did this test. Can you explain this to me? Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe there's an explanation for this. When I talked to the developers, it was just like, it was like way too complex for me to understand. Apparently there's like a 5D world where this all lives and German is close to English and in that quadrant.
Or they're making it up because German is not close to English. And I took some German in college. I'm not good at languages and I found it very difficult. So I don't see how close. I mean, it's all relative compared to Mandarin or something. Yeah, but
it's probably very closely related. But we kept talking. I was like lost in this 5D world that I couldn't even imagine.
Because I don't know what that is, 5D world.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. Yeah. And it's like we kept talking about it, and I was like, what if you're in front of a judge and you have to explain why I got the 6 out of 9. Could you just kindly explain that to me? And I got another 5D world and, they're adjacent, la, la, la. And I was like, I'm not sure if this developer knows what they predicted and how this tool exactly works, right? And I think that to me feels like, that's concerning. If we use tools that we don't know how they predict, what they exactly do, and if they break on impact, if like a journalist who doesn't know anything can quote unquote break these tools, right? We really have a lot more work to do.
Yeah.
So I think that those are like real concerns. And then, the other big concern I highlight in the book, and I've worked with folks who have disabilities, they played some of the games and there's an awful lot that came up with that. Like, why do they, if they have a physical motor disability, why do we have to hit the space bar as fast as we have to?
They should get an accommodation. I mean, usually you have that opportunity, hopefully, to get an accommodation.
You do have that opportunity, but I think for a lot of people who have a disability, they don't really want to tell that to an employer, right? Because they don't want to end up on a imagined pile B, right? And no one looks at that pile B because those are the people with accommodation. But I think a lot of people also, when you start playing a game, you don't know what you're being asked to do. Like how do you know
that's true
if you need an accommodation, right? Like that's another question. And then I think I'd also talked to some vocational counselors who work with, this thing in just case was just like folks who are deaf and hard of hearing, who definitely needed an accommodation for video interviews. And they said they called their accommodation line, they sent emails, and they never heard back. And I thought that was really concerning that these like very large companies, their accommodation pipelines don't even seem to work. And then there's all this like, statistical question. If you have a disability that you express it's expressed very individually, right? Like I might be autistic, but you might also be autistic, but that is expressed very differently. We're probably not in the training data, right? Like how on earth can this ever be caught by an AI tool? So I think we have a lot of thinking to do if one size fits all.
Yeah, well, that's a hard thing too. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. And I think we have to do a whole lot more skeptical questioning And I wish, I just really hope for the industry. What is really hard as a reporter is like that, obviously a lot of vendors don't want to talk about, don't want to give me access to the tools and like give me their technical reports. And I do feel
You
like,
need that
what?
technical report.
Maybe those technical reports should be public.
Yeah.
Like if this is how you like build your tool, these are your methods, this is how you
We
validated
may
it.
get there. I mean, I think with some of the new regulations, we can talk about, but
I'm happy to talk about that.
yeah, we're gonna. But some thoughts,
Okay.
on what you were just saying is really well. First of all, I feel like AI or not, I feel strongly about this. The uniform guidelines, even though they're pretty old, you could still apply that to any type of tool. There's nothing about explainability of models in the uniform guidelines. It's just all about how it was constructed. Is it job related, and does it have an adverse impact? And that holds true still to this day. I'm sure there'll be some modifications, but the tool doesn't is agnostic to that.
But Charles, can I ask about that? Like I do think that like the uniform guidelines are important and I think they should be updated and we really need to think about some of these things. But I also think like, the 4/5 rule that so many folks in the industry really feel strongly about, like we need to talk about that. And also, it took me a long time as an outsider to understand this, sort of that validity and discrimination are different things and one doesn't necessarily exclude the other. So, I remember like talking to legal counsel at the EOC and just like kept asking, I was like, well, we know that some of these tools don't work. Like, why is nobody doing anything? I'm just like really wondering. And the general counsel, the interviews in the book. So, I got clearance to use this. And he's like, we don't care if the tool works or not. And I was like, what? We don't care? Like, what?
Well, you should care if it works. I mean, that's the crazy thing. Like I identified that in the New York City law. I'm like, well, wait a minute. There's absolutely no mandate that the tool is valid. But the uniform guidelines say that your predictor must be job related. That is the ultimate litmus test. You can actually have adverse impact if the tool's been shown to be job related. It's just not a kind of people have a justifiably so, an ethical or a responsibility to not do that. But technically, it's legal. So, job relatedness trumps every single thing. We just know that it's good for us to monitor that a little, and maybe that's an update to the uniform guideline.
Yeah, and I feel like, with like the 4/5 rules, I think that a lot of folks feel like, oh, if I just pass the 4/5 rule, I'm pretty safe that the EOC is not going to actually check if I have a business as necessity and look at the validity, right? So like you have sort of this game that like, well, if I just pass the 4/5 rule, I'm probably in the clear.
Mm.
And I do think that we need a whole lot more transparency around some of these tools because I feel like sort of in the old days, right, if I applied for a firefighter job, I knew, I have to carry 200 pounds from A to B or whatever the test was, right? And I could train for that and I could challenge that test in court, right? And women have and other people have and said, like, is this really job relevant? Do you actually have to do this? Or is this a way to
Right.
sort of discriminate against women through the back door because, they're often physically less able to do these things? La, la, la. We've had these court battles. But the time that we now live in with these AI tools is like most of us actually don't know if we're being assessed, how we're being assessed. And it's really like it's almost impossible to challenge that, right? Because I don't know if
It
you're using
is.
an online resume screener and how that thing works. And I get rejected. Get rejected for a lot of jobs. Like, how am I supposed to know
Yeah,
that this is?
most people get rejected. Like it's not common that you are gonna, the odds are that you're not going to get selected. So that's why you got to apply to a lot of them. It's true, and I think there'll be some, hopefully some accountability that you have to show. I think as far as adverse impact goes, I mean, the 4/5 rule is the main thing, but there are other things that you look at, but they're all somewhat flawed. Like not to get too technical, the 2SD test, but that's sample size dependent. So you could pass that with a giant sample, I feel like there's another layer to it, and I look at it very holistically. How was the assessment constructed? And that would even go to the training data, but I think even in the more traditional sense, I had a really interesting experience one time. It was super eye-opening. I developed a biodata predictor tool for a large national bank that was basically, for tellers and personal bankers, right? And so my sponsor there did this amazing thing. He said, all right, you've written these questions. We're going to show these questions to a diversity review council of internal people at our organization that not only represent the diversity function, but are also diverse leaders, right? So
Okay.
we gave about 20 people this tool, and I'm a conscientious item writer. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible. They found at least 10 or 15 things that were so subtle in the cultural differences that I never would have thought of it. And
Yeah.
they stuck out to those people, and we went back and revised this thing, right? So who's doing that kind of stuff? Because I've never had another client actually agree to do that. When I bring it up, it's like, oh, that's too complicated or whatever. Admittedly, it's been a while, but there's a lot of things you can do there.
But it requires a lot of like thought and a lot of time and a lot of like adjusting. And I feel, yeah, I agree. But I think that's not what, a lot of companies are after. They have so many applicants. They have to, I get it. If I would get 3 million applicants, I don't want
Yeah.
folks
Look,
to go through it. I want a technological solution to
yeah.
my problem. But I think what I'm trying to say is like, let's not repeat the errors of the past and just use, problematic biased data and just put it in the tool, right? And then we replicate the problems, and then we bring in on top of that maybe other machine bias and sort of these wrong predictions of first names and hobbies and stuff we have hopefully rooted out in humans.
Soup of stuff. Yeah. So I heard another thing that the CEO of Indeed, I heard an interview or read an interview with him, and he was saying, well, one of the important things is who's coding this data, who's building these algorithms. Maybe we need to make sure diverse people are actually building the product. How much it certainly couldn't hurt. And hey, you want to have a workforce of diverse people no matter whatever they're building. But that was something I was like, oh man, I never thought of that. So there's a lot of layers to the end result of having a tool that you're fielding. I want to make sure that we get to this book. So why don't you hold it up? I asked you
Okay,
before
yeah,
in the
sure.
pre-call, like, what's the name of it so I could mention it. And you were saying, well, it's a really long name. So I can see it, the algorithm, how AI decides who gets hired, monitored, promoted, and fired, and why we need to fight back now. I would have put an exclamation point. Did your editor tell you no exclamation point? I'm liberal with punctuation, or maybe a few emojis on there.
I think that probably shows more about your personality. There's an AI tool that could figure you out based on your explanation part.
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh
totally,
my
totally.
God, I'm busted. Yeah. I am an extrovert. Yeah. So tell us about it. I mean, we've been talking about stuff in there, and I
Yes,
asked you for the
exactly. Like
takeaway.
all
What's
of
your
these
favorite
tools.
thing you found in this book? And why should people read it? That's a double question. I do that a lot. First, what's the favorite thing you found? The most lasting thing that is meaningful to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I found and what was really meaningful to me, and I think we as journalists also have sometimes overlooked people with disabilities
Mm-hmm.
going through these tools and being exposed to them. And I think that was really eye-opening to me to like work with people who have a disability, play the games with them and other things and like talk through them and sort of understanding like how difficult this is for them to navigate this world. And it even starts with like, the people to see their vocational counselor, they even have to take, have to get childcare, they have to get a bus pass, and it's like takes them forever to get there. And then a lot of these tools, like some of the vocational counselors were like, this is like, these people apply for janitorial jobs. Like, why do they need to have a personality test? Like, what does it
Yeah.
have to do with anything? Some of the vocational counselors, especially for some of them who are deaf and hard of hearing, they're like, all this stuff is timed and people who are deaf and hard of hearing, American Sign Language is considered a foreign language. It's not English that we speak and read. So for them, it's like, the vocational counselors will, I have to read the question. I have to sign it to them. They have to think about the answer, sign it back to me. I have to translate in English. Sometimes they don't understand things because, we say like the car crashed into the wall. They just have like a car crashing into the wall. It's a very different approach to language.
Right.
And they were like, we already timed out. We make it to 2 questions out of the whole assessment. They're like, this is really not working. And it's not built for people for other than like native English speakers in mind that are a certain way, and they
Mm-hmm.
felt so frustrated and there's no one to talk to anymore because it's all AI screen after AI screen. So they really felt like this is like putting a new screen for folks with disabilities, especially who can't get through that barrier. And really felt like they're being excluded to the job market. And we often only test for race and gender. And we don't test for other things if the tool works. And I think that's really to the detriment of everyone, because we want to make sure we have people are chosen on merit and because they have the minimum qualifications to do the job. And the question is, are we really, really doing it? So my hope is with this, looking at these tools and finding out that many really probably do more harm than they do good. And I think that's a sobering revelation. And looking at all of these tools, from video interviews to online screens of our data exhaust, to looking at AI games, resume screeners, the stuff that is used on us at work, and predictive flight risk, and blah, 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 to really look at all of these and sort of understand how do they work, how ubiquitous are they already, and how what is questionable about these approaches. And what should we do? That's why I think we have to have this conversation to think about well, how should we do hiring? What is a better way? How can we not replicate the mistakes in the past and put them into the technological tools? And I get you have to have technology help you. We are overwhelmed by these applications, but let's build better technology and let's make it transparent, right? Vendors don't tell me, a lot of companies are afraid that they won't have plausible deniability if they say, well, we use this tool on millions of people. They're really afraid that backlash comes out. And so I have some whistleblowers, especially employment lawyers, who get to test these and say oh yeah, we tested them. One AI games vendor was basically, they were we tested it every which way and it was always discriminating against women. And I was oh yeah, and what happened to the vendor? They're oh yeah, they're still around. They totally grew. And I was I hope they changed their ways and learned from this, but we don't actually know that, right? So I think we need to do better, and transparency is sort of a really big step in that.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I think you're right, or I know you're right. The other interesting thing is it's volume. I remember back I was working for really the first company, maybe the second, maybe arguable, depending on who you ask, that put tests online, and during that time, it was right when job boards really exploded too, right? And there was not the technology on the other side of a job board to handle what was happening. So that's where the ATS kind of came from. And, in some sense, it's still that volume, because if you look at executive assessment, managerial assessment, you're not using AI tools as much. It's much more high touch. It takes a longer time. You're probably getting even better, prediction. The more time you get to spend with somebody and understand them with good tools, the more you understand how well they can probably do a job, as long as you understand the job well enough, and make those connections. But at volume hiring, when you're just getting so many people, and now it's so easy, and you can get bots, I'm sure, to apply for you. In fact, I read an article about that. Like there's some bot a guy had it 5,000 applications, in one shot or something. So that creates even more noise, and that's what's making it hard. But
yes, and I think that's also kind of funny with generative AI. Now that we have ChatGPT, right?
I've had so
many job applicants. Yes, I did. So it's a great level playing field. I think a lot of job applicants feel, right, because they felt, look, hiring has always been unfair and tipped towards the employer, right? Because they make the ultimate decisions. Traditionally I could just sort of curate my application and what I send and the reference I would choose, right? I had some level of agency as an applicant. But with all of these AI screens, and often, maybe even using them on my Twitter and things I didn't necessarily consent to for the hiring process, I think a lot of people felt absolutely out of control. And they didn't know how these AI screens worked. They had sort of a sense of it. But now with generative AI, right, ChatGPT can write my resume, it can write a cover letter. So a lot of folks,
it can answer interview questions for me if I have it right there. And it's definitely a playing field, leveler in some sense. It's interesting to watch I think back a little while ago, I'm trying to remember when, but I wrote something about it's a ping pong match in that when there's fewer applicants for open positions, applicants can be picky. They can refuse to do things. They can ask for huge amounts of money. They have the power because the employers need them. It's not typically that way. It's typically that the employers have way more than they can handle to choose from, and they need tools or whatever, and then they can be kind of, jerks about it if they want to. Hopefully not. But so there's a balance, equilibrium back and forth. But to your points you're making, I do feel, but this is the paradox of AI. I feel optimistic and pessimistic at the same time, because optimistically we have some really good regulations that are starting. They're never going to be caught up to what's happening, but at least they're happening, right? And I think vendor transparency and third party auditing and a lot of that stuff it's going to be a huge industry. That doesn't mean that people won't find ways to buck the system or whatever. And I also think that vendors, there are a lot of conscientious vendors who really are using AI. And look, AI is machine learning. We've been using machine learning for a long time in more simplistic ways. It's when we get to neural networks and stuff that's been trained, I think it's on, open, bigger data sets, whatever. That's where it gets a little bit crazy. But I'll tell you too, I've seen some really good uses. Like we're always talking about AI on what I call the predictor side, like how are you measuring a person? But there's also really good AI that's been used to, help score open-ended or responses, or really build. So training an AI on experts solving a problem to score it, right? It's not as much measuring the thing about people. It's just saying when a person does these things, that's typically when a good pathway, or this is a less good pathway, or whatnot. And if you're a conscientious vendor, you're making sure that what's being done on that side of things it works. And I have seen that, and I think a lot of vendors are doing that, but they don't talk about that as much. It's much more this. And look, the biggest problems are on the front end of this thing, like you're talking about. And good for you for coming from the outside and not really having any preconceived notions, kind of experientially consuming this stuff and saying, whoa, because you've seen a lot more in depth than most in this area. So
yes, I get lucky that, right,
yeah,
that I'm a journalist. Like some of the vendors, like we're very very generous to talk to me and like talk to me about their methods, and are also okay with me, like sort of, when I talk to IOs and other experts, telling them, oh, is this a good idea? Like, but I think we have to have a lot of those conversations. I've also reported on auditing in two of the early audits and hiring that were paid for by the vendors to like third party entities. And I don't think those were actually good audits. In fact, there wasn't actually an audit
we need to
framework. So like
audit the
people came up with the
auditors. That's
Oh my God, absolutely. And, and some of them got criticized for like one of the audits was published with the company's employees on the audit. Like, is that like a conflict of interest free zone? No. And the other one was like a stakeholder discussion, basically, that didn't even look at the algorithm and how things are done. So I think we have to be very careful that we are not whitewashing
yeah.
not good technology with audits and like sort of give them a stamp of approval because one company paid or a vendor paid an outside party to do this kind of stuff. And I'm not seeing, so like, that's why I'm a little bit skeptical about the New York City law, because it's sort of,
Oh, that law's watered down to almost nothing. I have a guy coming on, Matt Scherer. He wrote some really good stuff. I don't know if you've read his stuff about how
oh,
the
totally.
AI. I mean, the New York law is really kind of a shill for big corporate interests to make it really easy. And that it's actually, his thing is that it's the first step in trying to remove the uniform guidelines, which I think is that gets a little bit conspiracy wise. But so tell us about regulation. You mentioned New York City, right? We have a lot of regulations, the EU stuff. So tell us what's your take on the ability of regulations that are happening to actually control, some of this stuff?
Yes. So I think regulation is important, but I think it's not going to be our savior, right? And we see that in the New York City law. And I was part of like sort of, going along documenting some of the processes. We have one problem is that like politicians often really don't know how this stuff works, and they need to be educated first, and they make decisions on not knowing this stuff. But I do think that like hiring needs to be part of this like high stakes pool, which like traditionally maybe we haven't really looked at that, right? It was like facial recognition and how long people go to jail, but it matters who gets a job. Like it matters how you get the job and if it's done on merit, because I really care about my job. I love my job. Thank I'm thankful that somebody chose me for this job. But, and I would be really pissed if I applied for my dream job and, I would get rejected because of a faulty algorithm that did something wrong based on whatever, like, correlation that it found that day. If I was rejected on merit, I would totally take that. But sort of, the New York City law, it's like not even really clear how to audit it. And I think the ACLU has looked at some of the audits. I think they counted 17 audits that have been published since the law has been
There's
enacted.
not many, because I've been trying to find people who I have seen a couple done by some good stuff. I'm able to do them. In fact, I've had also people. There's so much confusion. Couple people from overseas who said, "Oh, well, I need to find a certified New York City bias auditor." I'm like, there is a certification you can get from a nonprofit in New York, but it's not mandatory by any means. So there's just a lot of confusion. And as I talk to vendors and people, most everyone, I'm talking to a lot of IOs at big companies right now for a project, and they're all like, yeah, we're just kind of wait and see. We hadn't really done anything. But as the California law and then the EU law and then some federal laws, there's going to be stuff that people are going to have to comply with. And I believe one of the biggest things going to happen is vendor audit requirements, right? I mean, now vendors can say, oh, I've got the company X seal of approval, but there's no, like, that's just nice to have. There's no mandate that you have that, and who knows what goes into that. And those companies are for profit, companies that rely on these audits. So not to say they're all bad, but it's helping solve things. But at the same time, like you said, my take is companies need to have their own policies and practices, and they need to follow those damn things, and they need to make them, real, because this stuff, it matters, and the penalties aren't very strong. Even the New York City law, so you're not going to lose that much money.
Exactly.
So it's like,
exactly.
Yeah.
No, and I think, that's why we don't see a lot of compliance with the law. But I think also, like, I think people have to get a whole lot ethical and skeptical about these tools and really think through, like, would I use this on myself? Would I think that is fair if I use this tool? Because I think auditing, we've seen this with the subprime mortgages. They were all rated AAA by the auditors of these financial instruments, right? They were paid for by the companies. That is not a system that has proved itself very right. So we're using similar system here, right? So I think we should really be careful about that. So I think what might be also helpful on top of that is, like, more transparency, more even than the audits, like have actually an audit framework, maybe have, some people have said we need a government agency to pre-license these tools. So people have to open the books and show, here is what we did. Here's the validity. Here's how we tested it. And we tested it on more than, 120 to 25-year-old college students, if we want to use it on the general population, right? Like, there's all kinds of things that could be done. That seems a lot of work. And I don't think the government is, like, sort of suited or wanting to do that.
No.
But I hope it's like, if we mandate transparency, I think we might be able to actually have some non-for-profit groups. I'm sort of actually thinking, like, maybe we need to build, like, a non-for-profit group to, like, do interdisciplinary testing, not only journalists, but, like, I've worked with sociologists, computer scientists, all kind of interdisciplinary teams to have large sample sizes to test some of these algorithms, to actually, like, authoritatively say, like, we have examined it. Here's our scientific paper. Here's our methods. We can say this doesn't work because of X. And I think if we can test more of these tools and publish this, and actually maybe also build our own tools, and, like, let's see, can we build a resume screener that is not biased on keywords or whatever, and has a correlation versus causation problem? Well, if we can, let's put it on GitHub, and, like, pressure people to see, okay, this is how it's been done. Don't use bad technology. Use the technology that is proven to work and built on that, and steal what we made because we made it in the public interest. Maybe that is the next step, because I feel like vendors don't necessarily want to disclose a whole lot of stuff, and, like, science is expensive, Oh, the other thing I also wanted to say,
expensive. I like
we would love to do long-term studies, like, like, open your company to us. Like, we work with institutional review boards. Like, we make sure that this is, like, ethically sound, and, like, let us do a test over 5 years, like, to actually prove, does this work, and have people, You hire traditionally people who the tool set are successful, not successful. Let's hire them
You're
all
such an
and figure out
idealist.
over
I
5
don't want
years.
to rain on your parade, but I don't know if a lot of that's going to happen.
I think that would actually be helpful, having these long-term, because, we sort of try to build these tools for like successful employees. Like we don't even know what makes success in most
It's
jobs.
not just, also, it's important. It's not just vendors. There's a lot of companies that build stuff like this internally, which makes it even harder for anybody to know because they're like
Exactly.
building
Yeah.
their own stuff. And you see some, some things about that. And sometimes those things have been exposed, but you just never know. And the more digital exhaust is, prevalent or whatever, I mean, it already is, that the more you may not know. And so it's cat and mouse game. Well, give us a ray of sunshine from what you've done. Like where it's easy, and it's harder to find rays of sunshine. Other than we know that it is possible to field tools that are wholesome and good, and there's a lot of people who do that. And it's also true. I'm diverting a little bit, but I have to get this in, that humans have biases too, right? So it's not like we got a free lunch here.
Oh, no. And I think that's like one of the problems that I was struggling with, because I'm not advocating we go back to human hiring. Like human hiring is like super biased. Let's not do that.
Well, it's a combination, just like any AI, right? It's a combination.
But let's talk about the methods and what we do, and really think through, like, is AI having more data actually the solution, or are we bringing in so many more proxies that actually could be proxies for race or gender, and actually making this worse? So I think there is, a call for like basic regression analysis, and actually test these tools two ways, right? It's less sexy to use like the old school methods, right? Than the AI. It seems shiny and interesting, but like, actually, is the regression analysis as good as the AI? And if it is, or even just a little, if you only have 4 parameters, that might be much more controllable than using all this data salad, right? That have all these problematic proxies potentially. Well, let's do that. But then also the question is like, is hiring fair in general? Well, maybe the most fair thing is like we would have to hire people, have them do the job, and see if they can do that.
I love that part, right?
But then you have to like lay off a whole lot of people that are not good at it. It's like a
Well,
real
you know
problem.
what? Let's talk about, and I feel like this could be going 2 or 3 hours. We got to start wrapping it up. But that's why I love work samples and job simulations so much. And I think AI is going to be able to help put people into virtual, like, look, text. This is going to blow things wide open. And it's like, as I'm looking at my interests, being able to type text to photorealistic video is going to solve a lot of problems with simulations and work samples. There's still AI looking at what you're doing, but if you put someone in a controlled environment and say, here's the job, here's your little avatar, here's you in a VR, AR, whatever, do the damn job. It's been expensive and time consuming to do that because you haven't been able to brand it and make it locally specific. So you get these generic things that aren't really tapping into the precision of what it takes to be successful in that company. So you have some control there. It's job related. It could even be engaging, or it should be engaging. Realistic job preview. So if someone doesn't think it's a good job for them, they'll leave. Saves
it's
everybody
also
time and
helpful for
money.
me to understand what would the work, as an applicant, what would the job entail, right? Like, it's actually like helpful. I was like, oh, do I actually want to do that?
Yeah. So AI can help that way, and I think that GTP and everything, I feel like, well, we should have another edition where we talk about large language models, because, and well, I'll ask you this. We talked about this in the pre-call. You said that, because I figure writing a book is a long process. I've been writing one for about 5 years now, and so I haven't gotten even close to the end. But I said, well, did generative AI and, ChatGTP make it through into the book? And my guess is you probably went back and made sure to add it. But tell us how the book addresses that subject. What did you find about that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, generative AI is pretty slow coming into the HR enterprise in companies. We're still figuring that out. Can we have a chatbot answering questions? I think it's all, interesting, and we'll probably see some interesting applications. I think it's really blowing up on the applicant side, right? They feel like, wait, I now have AI to fight AI in like the resume screeners, like let the best AI win the cover letter. Folks use it to prep for interview questions, like, ChatGPT, give me an interview question, also give me answers. Some people use it actually probably in real time doing video interviews, and I don't think there's a whole lot of company safeguards. Like, I've done video interviews where I wasn't in front of the camera and I had a deep fake of my voice. I typed it out, say the things that I wanted the answer, and I got whatever, 75% or something like that match to the job. So we have this a lot, right? That people impersonate each other in these video interviews. And there's not a whole lot of things that the companies find there, especially if you use AI to just predict on the words that somebody says. Well, if that is a deep fake, a totally made up stuff, you might give me a job and it wasn't actually me. I think also people are concerned that for remote hiring, you give people a job and, maybe the wrong person shows up, but also they from day one get access to your systems. So this could be a backdoor in for hackers to steal company data. And I think the FBI actually put out a warning not too long ago. I don't know if a lot of employers have seen that they really need to be thinking about this.
Yeah.
That we can, ChatGPT can be really helpful as generative AI in general to folks like this to spoof and fool the hiring processes. And I haven't seen a lot of application of that, of vendors like building in, there's like facial recognition has like a life thing in there that you have to move your head.
You can still fake that. I mean, it's like an arms race.
Yeah, it totally is a cat and mouse game, right?
Yeah.
Like the same things for like monitoring at work, tried out mouse wigglers and that. And now the companies that track employees now say, oh, we can find the mouse jigglers and we can find this and we can find this. So it's like always a cat and mouse game. So, but I think that's something that I hadn't heard, that there's like actual like work fraud that I think companies need to be aware of.
Yeah, there's ethical things,
and
that go with it. Yeah. So I read a thing that was saying it was about people being afraid to admit they use GPT on the job, right? And I think there's this, and I did a presentation on the PsyOp thing about kind of the psychological safety of this. But in the article, one person said, well, I work remotely. I can use ChatGPT to do everything I need for my day's work in about 3 hours. And the rest of the time I just screw off. And so I'm like, And I interviewed ChatGPT for a podcast and I asked it about that. And its suggestion was, well, that person obviously needs more challenging work. They should be promoted. But I mean, it's like, is that person really going to say anything? And so, and if you could do that on a separate computer, that's not the company computer. So I view GTP really, it's almost like a consumer product or an individual product, right? And for companies to bring it in, they need to do a lot of work to isolate it or whatever, manage it with policy, which is some do, some don't at this point. Eventually everyone will. But that's the thing about it, is it's a consumer accessible power tool like nothing we've ever had. Honestly, the consumer has the power with this thing right now, I think.
It's also a great editor, right? Like, it's a great for like
amazing editor. I use it all the time.
For basic emails, basic writing. Like handbooks for companies. Like, don't write that from scratch. Like, get help with that. But obviously oversee it, because I've tried to like play around with it. And I teach investigative reporting, so I was like, oh, write me syllabus, and I was like, wow, basic first draft. But then I was like, oh man, I didn't know that Mark wrote this book. So cool. Like, an investigative reporter. And then I was like, Mark didn't write that book. You gotta like check that stuff out there, right? Like, we know that. It's just it's a great thing to like just write a first draft of very technical stuff, right? It's not very...
Yeah. It's no fun. I've written a lot of tech reports. It's no fun at all.
So use it as a good like first draft, and then use your human brain to go over it and make sure it's all correct, right? It's always.
That's all AI. We need to do both. It needs to be a harmonious partnership. So I'm going to ask one last question as we play out here. True or false? Within 10 years, will people's individual AI agents be interviewing, or companies, will bots be interviewing bots on behalf of both parties in the hiring equation?
I think we're already kind of seeing that happening. We have like
That's what we've just been
yes,
talking about,
yes.
right? In a little bit, right? Yeah.
Yes, and I think then we'll find new ways to interview people because it's going to be so unsatisfactory for the companies and for the applicants that it's like, I'll just have my avatar interview your avatar. Great. Like I didn't learn anything. I just learned the mediocre answers that ChatGPT has.
That they both lie to each other about stuff, and right,
Yeah.
so all right, well, good. We even have gone more than I usually go, but I could keep going for a
I
long
know it's
time, but
utterly
I know all our
fascinating.
listeners
That's
have
why
stuff to do.
I never stopped thinking about it. So I love to like talk to folks. I'm super
Plug the
interested.
book, tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Yes,
I can't wait to read
there's
it.
only one Hilke Schellman,
When is
so
it? Is
get in
it?
touch with me.
Yeah, is it out now? Available now, or is it?
It's available starting January 2nd,
Oh,
2024, which is,
soon.
super soon. It's out there. You can pre-order it. You can get it already.
Yep. Oh, good.
You get it on January 2nd.
I'm gonna do it.
And let me know what you think. I'm like, I'm giving people feedback. I also want feedback. So send me your feedback.
You on LinkedIn, I noticed, because I'm really getting kind of addicted to LinkedIn right now. When you posted something about it, you got like exponentially more comments and reactions than anything I've seen. So obviously a lot of people are looking at what you're doing, listening to what you're doing, and that's amazing because it's hard to get people's attention in this world right now.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people care about their job applicants themselves, maybe parents who have kids who are looking for jobs, right? A lot of every company has, of any size, of a certain size has HR. We care about work and we haven't really looked deeply into this. So I was really lucky that I got a chance to spend some time on it and really look into it and maybe also make it a little bit, I'm a journalist. I try to make it entertaining,
Well, yeah.
learning about these tools and but we need to know it if we want to change it, right? Like I can't change something if I don't know how it works. And I think we don't know enough. So that's my job here.
Well, and I think you've done a really good job, and I'll read the book, but I can already tell it's going to be great. So thank you very much. Fascinating conversation. And I'll have you on again. I feel like we need a chapter
Awesome.
two.
Thank you, Charles.
All right.
But there will be a lot more to talk about.
Oh my God, it's only going to get
Bye.
crazier. As we wind down today's episode, dear listeners, I want to remind you to check out our website, rockethire.com, and learn more about our latest line of business, which is auditing and advising on AI-based hiring tools and talent assessment tools. Take a look at the site. There's a really awesome FAQs document around New York City Local Law 144 that should answer all your questions about that complex and untested piece of legislation. And guess what? There's going to be more to come, so check us out. We're here to help.